The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Dr. Marcus Reed barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on the cascade of data streaming across 3 monitors in the cramped Arctic research station. Outside, the wind howled against reinforced windows, but inside, something extraordinary was happening. For 6 months, Marcus had been stationed at this isolated facility, officially studying quantum fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field. The real reason he was here? Buried in classified documents and funding from organizations that didn't officially exist, was far more intriguing. He was hunting for proof that consciousness could interact with quantum fields in measurable ways. Equipment hummed around him: sensitive magnetometers, quantum field detectors, and experimental devices that most scientists would dismiss as pseudoscience. But Marcus had seen things during his doctoral research that conventional physics couldn't explain. Moments when human emotion seemed to influence particle behavior in ways that violated everything he'd been taught. Tonight felt different. The readings had been erratic all evening, but not in the random way he'd grown accustomed to. There was a pattern here, something that resembled ... communication. Marcus leaned forward, his breath fogging slightly in the chilled air. The facility's heating system struggled against the brutal Arctic cold, keeping the temperature just warm enough for the sensitive equipment to function. He adjusted the frequency parameters and watched the display shift. There it was again. Pulse. Clear and deliberate, followed by a pause, then another pulse. It wasn't random electromagnetic noise. It wasn't equipment malfunction. This was intentional. His hands trembled slightly as he began recording. The signal seemed to strengthen when he focused on it, as if responding to his attention. Marcus closed his eyes and concentrated, thinking about the months of isolation, the loneliness that had become his constant companion, the desperate hope that his research would prove meaningful. The equipment suddenly came alive. Lights flashed across multiple displays, and the signal transformed from simple pulses into complex waves. Marcus opened his eyes, watching in amazement as the patterns evolved, becoming more sophisticated by the second. Without really understanding why, he reached out and placed his palm against the main detector array. The metal was cold against his skin, but something warm seemed to flow back through his fingers. The signal immediately intensified, and for a moment, Marcus felt something impossible: a presence. Vast and ancient, reaching across unimaginable distance to touch his mind. Images flashed through his consciousness. Cities of light hanging in space. Beings of pure energy moving through dimensions he couldn't comprehend. And strangest of all, other humans on Earth experiencing similar moments of connection. A woman painting a mural that painted itself back. A teacher watching his students bend reality with their thoughts. A musician creating sounds that bridged souls. The connection lasted only seconds before the equipment overloaded, circuits sparking and monitors going dark. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows across the silent station. Marcus sat in the sudden quiet, his heart pounding, knowing that everything had changed. He wasn't alone in this research. Somehow, somewhere, others were having similar experiences. The signal hadn't been coming from space or another dimension. It had been coming from within, from the collective unconscious of humanity itself, wakening to possibilities that science was only beginning to understand. Marcus reached for his emergency communication device. He needed to document everything to find the others who were experiencing these phenomena. The real work was just beginning. Nina Castellano wiped paint from her hands with a rag that had seen better days, stepping back to admire her latest work. The mural stretched across the entire side wall of Martina's bodega, a vibrant explosion of color depicting the neighborhoods. History children playing in fire hydrant spray. Elderly men playing dominoes. Families gathered around kitchen tables sharing meals and stories. The Bronx block had been her canvas for 3 years now. Each piece a love letter to a community, fighting against the creeping tide of gentrification. Glass condos were sprouting like weeds between century-old brownstones. And Nina felt the weight of preserving something precious before it vanished forever. She'd worked through the night, driven by an energy she couldn't explain, usually her. Murals took weeks to complete, but this one had flowed from her brush as if the wall itself was guiding her hand. Colors seemed to mix themselves, shadows fell perfectly without her conscious planning, and details emerged that she didn't remember. Painting, as dawn broke over the city, Nina noticed something that made her breath catch. In the corner of the mural where she'd painted a young girl dancing, the figure seemed ... different, more detailed than her usual style. The child's eyes held a depth that Nina's technique couldn't typically achieve, and the girl's expression conveyed a longing that felt achingly familiar. Nina shook her head, attributing the strangeness to exhaustion. She packed her supplies and headed home to her studio apartment, where she collapsed onto her bed still, wearing paint-stained clothes. When she returned the next afternoon to add finishing touches, a small crowd had gathered around the mural. Mrs. Rodriguez from the bodega was pointing and talking rapidly in Spanish to her daughter, while several teenagers stood mesmerized. "Nina," Mrs. Rodriguez called out, "come look at this. Your painting... it's different."
Oh.
Nina approached slowly, her stomach knotting with inexplicable dread. The mural looked exactly as she'd left it, except for one impossible detail. The dancing girl she'd noticed that morning was now facing a different direction, and her hands were extended as if reaching for something beyond the wall's edge. "I don't understand," Nina whispered. "It changed," said Miguel, one of the teenagers. "I watched it happen around noon." The girl just ... moved, like she was trying to get somewhere. Nina's hands shook as she touched the wall. The paint was dry, set exactly as it should be after a night of curing. But as her fingers traced the figure's outline, she felt a warmth. That had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. Over the following days, the impossible continued. Each morning, something in the mural had shifted. The dancing girl seemed to be moving through the painted scene, interacting with other figures, sometimes appearing sad, sometimes joyful. More disturbing were the new elements that appeared. Things Nina definitely hadn't painted. A quantum equation materialized along the bottom edge, written in precise handwriting that wasn't hers. Strange symbols appeared in the background that looked almost like sheet music, but followed no notation system she recognized. And in one corner, a bearded man in a lab coat began to take shape, as if someone else was painting on her wall in the dead of night. The neighborhood was talking. Some called it a miracle, others whispered about spirits and magic. Nina found herself spending entire days sitting across the street, watching her creation evolve without her input. She started a journal, documenting each change, trying to find patterns or meaning. On the seventh night, unable to sleep, Nina returned to the mural with a flashlight. As its beam illuminated the wall, she gasped. The dancing girl had turned to face outward, her painted eyes meeting Nina's real ones across the impossible barrier between art and reality. Nina reached out tentatively. Her fingers tingled as they touched the girl's painted face. For a moment that stretched like eternity, she felt a connection to something vast and profound, other minds, other hearts, reaching across space and time. She sensed a lonely scientist in a frozen wasteland, a teacher discovering magic in mundane moments, a musician learning to build bridges with sound. When the sensation faded, words had appeared beneath the girl's feet in Nina's own handwriting. Though she didn't remember writing them, "We are not alone. The signal calls to all of us." Nina stepped back, understanding that her art had become something more than paint, and wallet was a window, a message, a beacon for others who were experiencing the impossible. James Okafor had been teaching 8th grade science at Washington Middle School for 12 years. It's long enough to recognize when something extraordinary was happening in his classroom.
Nice.
What started as a routine lesson on electromagnetic fields had turned into something that would haunt his dreams and challenge everything he thought he knew about reality. It began with Keisha Williams, a quiet girl who usually sat in the back row, more interested in sketching in her notebook than participating. In discussions, during the demonstration with simple circuits and LED lights, she'd raised her hand for the first time all semester. "Mr. O, what if you don't need wires for electricity to flow?" James had smiled, ready to launch into an explanation about wireless power transmission. When Keisha did something impossible, She placed her hands near the disconnected LED on his desk, closed her eyes, and concentrated. The light flickered, then blazed to life without any power source. The classroom erupted in gasps and excited chatter. James stared at the glowing LED, his scientific mind racing through possible explanations. Static electricity, hidden batteries, some kind of trick? But as Keisha maintained her concentration, the light grew brighter, pulsing in rhythm with her breathing. "How did you do that?" James asked, his voice barely steady. Keisha opened her eyes, looking as surprised as everyone else. "I just felt the electricity. Like it was already there, waiting." Word spread through the school like wildfire. By the next day, James found his classroom packed with curious students and skeptical administrators. Principal Torres stood in, the back arms crossed, clearly expecting to debunk what she assumed was an elaborate prank. But it wasn't just Keisha. As James set up more experiments, other students began displaying similar abilities. Marcus Chen could make compass needles spin by staring at them. Aaliyah Thompson caused the classroom's ancient computer to boot up just by placing her hands on the monitor. Most unsettling of all, when the students worked together, their individual effects amplified dramatically. Dr. Sarah Brennan from the district office arrived by Friday. Bringing sophisticated equipment and a healthy dose of skepticism, James watched nervously as she set up electromagnetic field detectors and video cameras. Determined to find the rational explanation behind what everyone was calling miracles, the demonstrations she witnessed defied every scientific principle James had ever taught. 8 students sat in a circle around a collection of electronic devices: calculators, digital clocks, small radios, LED strips. Without touching anything, they focused their collective attention on the equipment. The devices responded like an orchestra following an invisible conductor. Calculator displays cycled through complex mathematical sequences. Radio static resolved into faint music from stations that shouldn't have been receivable. LED strips created patterns of light that seemed to tell stories in color and rhythm. Dr. Brennan's equipment recorded electromagnetic anomalies unlike anything in the scientific literature. The students weren't generating conventional electrical fields, they were somehow manipulating the quantum foam of reality itself, bending the fundamental forces of nature through focused consciousness. "This is impossible," Dr. Brennan whispered, staring at her readings. "That's what I thought too," James replied. "But I've tested every variable I can think of. It's not tricks. It's not technology we're not seeing. It's them. They're doing something. That shouldn't be possible. Their case." James found himself documenting patterns. The students' abilities were strongest when they felt emotionally connected to each other, to the lesson, to a sense of purpose larger than themselves. Fear or doubt would shut down the effects immediately, but curiosity and wonder made them flourish. More disturbing were the dreams James started having. Visions of other people experiencing similar phenomena, women painting murals that painted themselves back, a scientist in an Arctic station receiving impossible signals, a musician whose sounds could merge human consciousness. The dreams felt too vivid, too consistent to be mere imagination. On a quiet afternoon, as James watched his students unconsciously synchronize the blinking of every electronic device in the room, Keisha approached his desk. "Mr. O," she said quietly, "do you ever feel like we're all connected to something bigger? Like there's this signal out there, trying to wake people up?" James looked at her with new understanding. These weren't random manifestations of impossible abilities. This was part of something larger, a phenomenon spreading across the world, calling to certain individuals who were ready to embrace a reality far stranger and more wonderful than anything. In his textbooks, he pulled out a notebook and began writing. If this was really happening, if consciousness itself was evolving, then someone needed to document it. Someone needed to find the others who were experiencing the impossible and help them understand what it meant. Rosa Delgado descended into the underground recording studio like a diver entering an alien world. 3 stories beneath the chaos of downtown Los Angeles, her sanctuary existed in soundproofed isolation, a maze of cables, synthesizers, and acoustic panels where she'd spent the last 5 years pushing the boundaries of experimental music, tonight felt different, charged with possibility. For weeks, Rosa had been experiencing something she couldn't explain, hearing music that wasn't there, frequencies that seemed to bypass her ears entirely and resonate directly in her bones. Traditional instruments felt inadequate, like trying to paint a sunset with only black ink. She powered up her custom-built sound system, Frankenstein's monster of vintage analog equipment and cutting-edge digital processors. The studio's walls were lined with speakers of every size and frequency range, capable of producing sounds from subsonic rumbles that could shake buildings to ultrasonic frequencies that hovered at the edge of human perception. Rosa began with familiar territory ambient drones and textural landscapes that had made her a legend in underground music circles. But as the session progressed, something unprecedented began to happen. The sounds she created seemed to take on a life of their own, evolving in ways that her programming couldn't account for. A simple bass tone started shifting, developing harmonics that shouldn't have been possible with the equipment she was using. The frequency patterns became increasingly complex, almost like a language trying to communicate. Rosa found herself less controlling the music and more channeling it, her hands moving across the controls with intuitive precision that bypassed her conscious mind. Then she heard them voices in the sound, whispers embedded in the frequencies that seemed to carry emotions rather than words. Rosa leaned forward, adjusting the mix to isolate the phenomena, and gasped as the whispers resolved into something impossible. The thoughts and feelings of people she'd never met. Through the music, she experienced flashes of other lives. Lonely scientist in an Arctic station, reaching out across vast distances. An artist watching her mural change without her input. A teacher witnessing his students bend reality with their minds. The connections felt as real as physical touch, more intimate than any human relationship she'd ever experienced. Rosa began experimenting deliberately, crafting specific frequencies that seemed to amplify these connections. She could sense collective emotions from the city, above joy, fear, loneliness, hope, blending into a complex emotional symphony. At 528 Hz, individual consciousness seemed to merge, boundaries dissolving between self and other. Her breakthrough came near dawn, when exhaustion had stripped away her analytical mind's resistance to the impossible. Rosa created a frequency pattern unlike anything she'd attempted before, sonic mandala that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. As the sound filled the studio, the very air began to shimmer. The room transformed into something beyond physical space. Through the music, Rosa found herself standing in a vast cathedral of pure sound, where every human emotion existed as visible light, every thought as tangible texture. Other figures moved through this space, the scientist with his quantum detectors, the artist with paint-stained fingers, the teacher surrounded by his gifted students. They were all connected, Rosa realized, linked by something far more profound than electromagnetic waves or quantum entanglement. The frequencies she'd discovered were revealing the hidden network of consciousness that connected all human experience. The background music of existence that most people learn to ignore. When the vision faded and Rosa found herself alone in her studio again, the equipment around her displayed readings that shouldn't have been possible. Frequency analyzers showed patterns that violated physics, harmonic structures that created impossible mathematical relationships. But more than the technical anomalies, Rosa felt changed. The isolation that had driven her to make music in underground solitude was gone, replaced by an awareness of connection that transcended physical proximity. She understood now that her experiments weren't just creating sound, they were building bridges between souls. Rosa reached for her phone and began making calls. If others were experiencing similar phenomena, they needed to find each other. The frequency that connected all consciousness was growing stronger. And Rosa suspected they were approaching something unprecedented in human history, a moment when the barriers between individual minds would dissolve entirely, revealing a vast symphony of collective human awareness that had been playing in the background all along. The music wasn't ending, it was just beginning, and Rosa knew exactly where to find the others who could hear it too. The Arctic wind had calmed to an eerie stillness as four unlikely companions stood before Dr. Marcus Reed's research facility. their breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. Rosa Delgado clutched a portable sound system, its cables snaking. 2 speakers positioned around the perimeter. James Okafor checked his tablet, documenting electromagnetic readings that defied explanation. Nina Castellano held a paint-stained canvas, its surface alive with shifting colors that seemed to respond to the aurora dancing overhead. They had found each other through a combination of digital breadcrumbs and impossible synchronicity. Rosa's frequency experiments had led her to James's published data on consciousness-influenced electromagnetic fields. Nina's transforming mural had somehow incorporated Marcus's quantum equations before she'd ever heard his name. The connections were too precise to be coincidence, too meaningful to ignore. "The readings are off the charts," Marcus said, gesturing toward banks of equipment that hummed with barely contained energy. "Whatever we've been individually experiencing, it's all converging here." For 3 months, each had documented their impossible discoveries in isolation. Now, standing together in this remote place where the Earth's magnetic field was thinnest, they could feel something building a resonance that grew stronger with each passing moment. "It's not just us," Nina said quietly, her eyes fixed on the canvas that continued to evolve without her touch. "I can feel others out there, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, experiencing variations of the same awakening." James nodded, watching his tablet display patterns of consciousness, influenced fields that were spreading like ripples across the globe. "My students weren't unique. Similar reports are coming in from schools worldwide. Children and adults suddenly demonstrating abilities that should be impossible." Rosa adjusted her equipment, fine-tuning frequencies that seemed to harmonize with the planet's natural electromagnetic pulse. "The music is everywhere now. You can hear it in the wind, in the movement of the aurora, in the quantum static between atoms. We're not creating this phenomenon, we're just learning to perceive it." Marcus moved between his instruments, tracking energy patterns that had transformed from subtle anomalies into undeniable reality. "I think we're witnessing the next stage of human evolution. Not physical adaptation, but consciousness expansion. The barriers between individual minds are becoming permeable." As if responding to his words, the aurora above them intensified, sheets of green and gold light dancing with unprecedented vigor. Rosa's speakers began producing sounds. None of them had programmed complex harmonies that seemed to originate from the interaction between Earth's magnetic field and their collective presence. Nina's canvas exploded with new imagery, a vast web of light connecting every human being on the planet, pulsing with shared emotions and thoughts. The dancing girl from her mural was now part of an endless chain of figures, each reaching toward the next in an unbroken circle of connection. James's tablet showed electromagnetic signatures from individuals across 6 continents, all displaying similar patterns of consciousness expansion. Teachers reporting students with inexplicable abilities. Artists creating works that changed independently. Musicians hearing melodies that seemed to come from the collective unconscious. Scientists detecting quantum anomalies that correlated with human emotional states. Were the early adopters, Marcus realized. The first to recognize and document what's happening. But the phenomenon is accelerating. Within a generation, this kind of consciousness expansion might be the norm rather than the exception. Rosa's music reached a crescendo that seemed to unlock something fundamental in the fabric of reality itself. For a moment that lasted an eternity, the 4 experienced complete unity of consciousness. They felt every emotion, every thought, every hope and fear of every human being touched by this awakening. The sensation was overwhelming and beautiful, terrifying and transcendent. When their individual awareness returned, they found themselves forever changed. The loneliness that had driven each to their isolated discoveries was gone, replaced by an permanent sense of connection to something vast and loving. They could still feel the network of awakening consciousness growing stronger. With each passing day, "What happens now?" Nina asked. Marcus looked at his instruments, which continued displaying readings that would revolutionize science. "Now we document everything. We find others who are ready to understand. We help humanity prepare for what's coming." James held up his tablet, showing global distribution patterns of the phenomenon. "This isn't ending, it's just beginning. In 5 years, maybe 10, The majority of human consciousness will have access to this expanded awareness. Rosa smiled. Her music equipment now silent, but somehow still producing the faint harmony that seemed to connect all living things. The frequency was always there. We just learned how to tune in as they packed their equipment and prepared to return to the world, each carrying proof of humanity's next evolutionary leap. The aurora above them pulsed one final time of farewell from forces beyond their understanding, but no longer beyond their connection. The signal that had called to them individually had revealed its true purpose: to awaken the bridges between human souls, preparing the species for a future where consciousness itself would be the next frontier of exploration and growth.